Hi, I'm Ben from Moco Toolbox. In this video, I'm going to explain how to create slow motion effects using stop motion technique. I've shot this slow motion video as stop motion, which seems like it's being shot as live action movement with a high speed camera, but I've actually used a regular mirrorless camera and shot several stills to create this slow motion video. This is a very cool effect which you can use to add dramatic feels to your animation or use it to shoot a product in a slow motion to create an advertising video. Unlike shooting on high-speed cameras, which are super expensive, you have full control over the movement in this technique. While using high frame rate cameras, for most parts, you need to rely on luck to get the shots that you like. You throw something up or something's falling down and spinning in the air, and you're shooting just part of that movement and hoping to get the movement that you like. But with the stop motion and the technique that I'm going to explain, you have full control over how things move and creating somehow the same effect as a high-speed camera. First, I'm going to explain the concept of slow motion in a stop motion. Then I'll show you how I rigged a dice and how I use the motion control kit that I've created to move the dice. And finally, I'll show you the process in Dragonframe and how I programmed the move and captured this video. So stay with me. In order to explain the concept of a slow motion in a stop motion, I need to go back to the principles of filming. Because when shooting a stop motion, there is no live action happening in front of the camera, and there is no native frame rate settings on the camera. You are shooting stills and the camera is in still mode, unlike filming that you set the camera, for example, at 24 frames per second, 30, 60, or whatever, and some real life action is happening in front of the camera as it's filming. So we need to understand how filming works, how slow motion works, so we can translate the concept into stop motion. When filming, we all know that 24 is the minimum frame rate that our eye perceives movement smoothly enough to create the illusion of a continuous movement. Below that, we won't have real lifelike movements. Of course, at some applications like animation, we can go lower than 24 and we shoot at 12 or even 8 frames per second. But generally, 24 is the minimum that our eye can perceive a movement as smooth as what is happening in real life. Imagine that we are filming someone running from one place to another. If we shoot at 24 frames per second and we shoot only 1 second, we have 24 images to play back as a sequence to create a 1 second film. Now, if we want to slow down the action and see the guy running so slowly, why do we need to shoot at higher frame rates like 60 or 120 or 240 or above that? Let's say we want to see the 1 second action happening in 10 seconds. So we see what's happening 10 times slower than what's happening in real life. So we need 10 seconds of footage. If we're gonna need 24 frames for each second and we want 10-second footage, we are going to need 240 frames to be able to see a 10-second video smooth enough as a real-life action. That's why we need to shoot at higher frame rates in order to have slow motion video. Does that make sense? So how does the concept of shooting at higher frame rates translate into stop motion? In a stop motion, every action is described in terms of timing and spacing. It means that in how much time, how far an object or a puppet has moved. So we know that if we're moving an object from one position to another, the distance that the object moves on each frame can be translated into how fast or how slow that motion is happening. Let's go back to the filming example. The person that is running from one place to another. When a person moves, it moves continuously in real life. But when the camera captures film, it captures samples of that movement. So when a person is moving, for example, 24 inches in 1 second, and we are filming that person at 24 frames per second, we are getting samples of the movement every 1/24th of the second. So when the person is at the beginning of the movement, we take one sample as frame 1, and when they are 1 inch further, we take another sample, and that would be the frame 2, and so on until we take 24 samples of the continuous move that the person is doing as 24 frames of that movement. If we want to recreate this movement in stop motion, we are going to move, for example, our puppet 1 inch on the first frame and take a shot, and then move the puppet 1 inch more and take a second shot. So we'll be moving the puppet 24 inches overall after 1 second of the movement. So when the camera is shooting at 240 frames per second, it means that the camera is taking samples every 1/240th of the second. So you should divide each inch of the movement into 10 divisions and capture one frame at each division. That means that you are taking more samples of that continuous movement to have more positions of the person who is moving to be able to play it back slower. So when we're talking stop motion, in order to create a slow motion effect, we need to change the spacing of the movement. So if we've been moving the object or the person 1 inch at a time, to create a slow motion effect, we need to be moving them 1/10 of an inch at a time, so we can have 10 times slower action. Now a question would be how tiny the increments in the movement should be to create the slow motion effect. If you are using a reference video to animate a puppet or to animate an object, you can simply divide the distance you'll be moving the object or the puppet from one frame to another by the times that you want to see it slower when you play back the actual animation. When you want to make a slow motion of a real life action, like an object is dropping, which follows the physics rule of this world, there are ways to calculate how far you need to move the object on each frame so it feels natural according to what slow motion speed you want to get. For this video, I thought it would be fun to try to mimic the slow motion effect of a real slow motion camera that can shoot at 1,000 frames per second, like an Alexa or a Phantom camera. So I wanted to see how I can calculate the distance between each frames in a way that when I play back the video of the dice falling down, it feels like you've actually shot it with 1,000 frames per second slow motion camera. To do the math, we're going to need a simple physics formula. Imagine this is a scaled up model of a dice which we want to drop, and we want to film it falling down as it's spinning around its center. We want to calculate how far this dice should be traveling from the moment it starts the movement throughout the video, so when you play it back, to feel like it's a real dice, but actually with through a scale, which you dropped it and filmed it with a real 1,000 frames per second camera. We can calculate the distance a freely falling object travels by this formula. Distance equals 1/2 acceleration times the time square. Again, you know, we don't have to deal with math and calculations, and you can just play it by ear, experiment while you're animating and see what the results are. But I just like to be able to recreate something that equals to something that is happening in real life with a real camera and a real dice falling. That's why I'm going through like this equation. It's simple, but if you like it, follow me. If you're not, you can skip this part of the video. X is the distance traveled in meters. G is the acceleration due to gravity, which is approximately 9.8 meters per second square on Earth. And T is the time in seconds. I'm going to shoot 200 frames in a stop motion. And since I want to recreate what a 1,000 frames per second camera can shoot, shooting 200 frames equals to shooting with that real camera for 1/5 of a second. See, 1,000 frames in 1 second, so 200 frames, it's like shooting 1/5 of that time. It means that we are shooting 1/5 of a second of the dice traveling as it's dropping down. Through these numbers in the formula, we have x equals to 1/2 multiplied by 9.8 multiplied by time squared, which is 1/5 of a second square, which gives us 0.196 meters, which equals to 90.6 centimeter or 196 millimeters. If we consider the movement like linear, which is not in reality, and we are shooting 200 frames, and the overall distance that the dice needs to be traveling from top to down would be around 200 millimeters. So on each frame, the dice should travel 1 millimeter down. So it's gonna be so tiny increments in the movement. And then it's gonna spin at the same time as it's falling down. Did you notice that in the formula, there is no relation to the mass? So it doesn't matter if you're dropping a dice, a watermelon, or a person, they will all hit the ground at the same time. And it's interesting. Actually, we haven't considered the resistance of the air. So if you drop a feather and a dice, the feather will come down much slower because of the air resistance. But if we neglect that air resistance, it doesn't matter how heavy the object is, the gravity will accelerate them same, and they will get to the surface at the same time. I think this is interesting. For shooting this stop motion, I'm gonna use the motion control kits that I've created to be able to move the dice precisely on each frame. Without motion control equipment and using motors and rails and this kind of stuff, it's gonna be so hard to create a very smooth slow motion effect. That's why I'm gonna rig the dice to attach it to a motor and then program that motor to move the dice as we calculated. In the next section of the video, I'm going to show you how I rigged the dice and attached it to a rod very precisely to connect it to a motor and then program the motor in Dragonframe to make the animation. To have the minimum amount of material around the dice, I decided to use a 1/16 of an inch rod to hold the dice. So I needed to make a hole into the dice and glue the rod and push the rod into the hole. The way I wanted the dice to be rotating around itself was anchoring from one corner. I didn't want the dice to be rotating like this. I wanted it to be rotating from this corner so we can see more beautiful play of the shadows and highlights as it's rotating and falling down. When I need to create a hole in a tiny object like a dice, I usually use a rotary tool like a Dremel instead of a drill. And for those of you who don't know, the difference between a rotary tool and a drill is the rotation speed. A typical drill spins like 2,000 to 3,000 rotations per minute. But a rotary tool like Dremel can rotate up to 25,000 or more in a minute. And as the rotary tool rotates so fast, it can chip out a tiny bit of material at each rotation and use less force to create a hole. Unlike a drill that should scoop out more material in each rotation and use more force to create the hole. That's why it's much cleaner to use a rotary tool instead of a drill. First, I try to hold the material by hand upright to create the hole. When I tested it, the hole was not created at the right direction and the dice was spinning off center. So I thought I need a kind of jig to secure the dice in place at the correct angle. So when the Dremel bit goes in vertically, it goes at the exact right angle. I designed this 3D printed jig or tray or whatever we can call it and place the dice inside and try to create a hole again. Third time's the charm, and I was able to create a nice hole at the right direction so the dice can spin around its center axis nicely without bouncing up and down due to the displacement of the rod. Then we'll need a thicker piece of material to hold the thin rod to couple it with the motor shaft. Coupler I'm using is a 5mm coupler, so I'm gonna design a simple 5mm cylinder, place a hole at the top for the rod to slide in, and use this to connect the dice to the motor. Now that we have a nice solution to connect the dice to our rig, it's time to set up the kit, connect it to Dragonframe, and start programming the move. I'm going to use 2 axes of movement for this shoot. One motor will be in charge of moving the dice up and down, and the other will be in charge of spinning the dice around its center axis. I'm going to use 2 of the 4 motors that this interface supports. I'm connecting the DF Moco interface to Dragonframe. I have all the axes set up previously. I'm not going to need to set up the axes from scratch. If I had to, it's not that complicated. Now I can move the dice up, down, and spinning around its center. A nice thing with programming a movement in Dragonframe motion control is that you can play with the movement curves to create ease in, ease out, or change the overall look of the movement curve so it can follow the kind of movement that you have in mind. And in this case, since the dice will be starting to move with no velocity and then accelerating exponentially, I need a movement curve like this. A linear movement won't look that natural here. You might not be able to tell since it's just a few seconds of slow motion movement, but if it was longer, it would be nice to create something that mimics a real life movement. So I'm going to play with the movement curve and create that exponential velocity change a freely dropping object will get. So we'll have something like this. Now I have all the setup ready, the lighting, camera angle, everything. And now I've programmed a move. The dice is ready to move from point A to point B. What Dragonframe does is that it divides the movement in 200 divisions, and on each frame it will move the dice to its next position, stays there so I can take the shot, and then Dragonframe will move the motors so the dice goes to its next position, stays there, and I take the next shot, and so on until I take all the 200 shots. Now I have all the stills ready for the post. It won't be too complicated to remove this rig. I have the clean background, and I've put this piece of blue tape around the rod. So first I'm gonna try to key out the blue and see how clean it will look, and then probably do some masking and retouching to create the final slow motion video. And here's what we get. I'm really happy with the results. It feels like the dice is actually falling down. We can play a lot with this. We can shoot this on green screen and key out each dice and then put several together. I'm gonna try this later. And then something that I have in mind and we'll try later is to have the dice bounce off the table. So as it's dropping, it hits the surface and bounces back and hits the surface again. It would be a fun experiment to do. Yeah, there's a lot we can do with this kind of setup and get real nice and dramatic results. If you'd like to learn more about this motion control kit, please check out this video here. I've explained what all the kit's pieces are and how you can use it, and a lot of details in the video. If you like this video, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you like to learn more about stop motion techniques, rigging, motion control, different combination of video and stop motion. Please check out my previous videos and also subscribe to be able to follow my upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching.